The U.S. Supreme Court just hit the pause button on some high-profile deportations, and it did so in the dead of the night. Why would the court step in at 1 a.m. to stop deportation flights? The answer has to do with due process, those basic fair procedures we expect in America, and whether non-citizens are getting even a minimal chance to be heard before being shipped off. As a constitutional litigator, I find a lot of Americans, even other commentators, get confused about what due process really means. It's like the old Princess Bride movie.
You keep using the word. I don't think it means what you think it means.
Today, we're breaking down the Supreme Court's emergency move to temporarily halt certain deportations. It stems from the ACLU's challenge to the government's use of an old law called the Alien Enemies Act. In plain English, the government wanted to deport a group of immigrants, in this case Venezuelan men, accused of gang ties, really fast, potentially without the kind of hearing you'd normally expect. But first, why did the Supreme Court pump the brakes? In America, due process of law is a big deal. That usually means if the government is going to take action against you, whether it's putting you in jail or deporting you, you get a fair chance to defend yourself. Here, the Supreme Court was worried that these immigrants weren't getting even the basic chance. The ACLU alleged that some of them had no real notice or time to challenge their deportation. Imagine being set to be expelled from the country with essentially no warning and no hearing. Fairly scary, right? So the court stepped in with an emergency order saying, wait, don't deport them yet. Give them a bit of time to go to court. The temporary halt is basically the court ensuring the government follows the rules, even in a rush. But this doesn't spell the end of mass deportations. The government did not have an initial opportunity to respond to the ACLU's claims, and the matter was rather rushed. So there's some concerns about procedural fairness. For now, the Supreme Court elected to have a short pause to clarify what rules are being followed. Now, you might wonder, don't people facing a deportation always get a trial? Many Americans are confused about this. And this is where things get interesting. The level of due process in deportation cases is very different from what you see in criminal cases. Due process doesn't mean the same thing in every area of the law. If you're a U.S. citizen charged with a crime, you have a ton of rights. You get a lawyer, even if you can't afford one, a jury of your peers. The government has to prove you guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. You get a speedy trial, and so on. None of that's guaranteed in immigration cases. Deportation is technically a civil proceeding, not a criminal one, so the government doesn't provide you a lawyer, and the rules are a lot more relaxed. In a criminal case, if you can't afford a lawyer, the court will appoint one for you. But in deportation cases, there's no free lawyers. You're on your own unless you can find help. In a criminal case, jury trial and an impartial judge. Deportation, no jury, just an immigration judge who actually works for the Department of Justice, the same department trying to deport you. Burden of proof? Criminal prosecutors must prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. We've all heard that on TV. It's the highest standard. But in immigration, officials only need to show it's pretty likely you're deportable. Clear and convincing evidence standard. It's a much easier bar to clear. Evidence? If you're in criminal court, if the police gathered evidence illegally, it usually gets thrown out. In immigration court, even evidence from an illegal search might be used against you. The strict rules of evidence just don't apply. Speed and appeals? As a citizen defendant, you have a right to a speedy trial, and you can appeal a conviction. As an immigrant in deportation, you might sit in detention for months with no guarantee of a speedy hearing, and your appeal options are limited and fast-tracked. You could be put on a plane while your case is still in progress. So due process for non-citizens is a much leaner version of what citizens get in court. It's not a new invention, and we've covered some of these cases before. In the late 1800s, there were the so-called Chinese exclusion cases and the Japanese immigration cases. On top of that, several sets of cases I've discussed in earlier videos throughout the 1900s showed this too. And remember, when the Supreme Court reviewed Judge Boasberg's national injunction against some deportations in Trump versus JGJ, the Supreme Court reminded him, and reminded you, the nation, that when the executive acts in the area of immigration and deportation, it usually precludes judicial review. This is something most commentators miss and something I think important to repeat. So the Supreme Court knows this, and it isn't saying immigrants get all the rights of a criminal defendant. But what the court is saying is, even in the immigration system, there's a floor of fairness, a minimum level of process the government has to provide. In this case, the justices were simply worried that the floor wasn't being met. So they imposed a short timeout on deportations to make sure people have a chance to speak up in court before they're removed. Now, it's crucial to understand, the ruling's not a final judgment on whether these deportations under the Alien Enemies Act are legal or not. Supreme Court didn't say the policy's fine or it's unconstitutional. Not yet. All they said was, for now, the government must hold off on deporting these folks until the legal questions are sorted out properly. Think of it like a referee blowing the whistle to pause the game because someone might have broken a rule. The game isn't over. It's just a hold while they check the play. Interestingly, not everyone in the court agreed with the pause. Justice Samuel Alito, one of the conservative justices, was pretty unhappy. In a dissent, he basically called the court's late-night order questionable. He thought the court rushed in too fast without waiting for lower courts or even hearing the Trump administration's side. Alito's point was, we didn't need to do this at midnight. The lawyers challenging the deportation maybe didn't follow the normal process, and we should have been more patient before we pulled the trigger. In short, he felt the court was being overzealous in intervening. But the majority of justices felt that the risk of irreparable harm was too high. If they didn't act, people could be deported to potentially dangerous conditions without any court ever hearing their case. By the time the usual process played out, it would be too late to undo a wrongful deportation. So where does this leave us? Non-citizens don't have all the same rights as citizens in court, but our system does insist on a baseline of fairness, notice, chance to be heard, and a decision that isn't made arbitrarily. This Supreme Court order is really about protecting the baseline. For you and me, it raises an interesting question. How much process is due to someone facing deportation to a place where their life could be at risk? The court's signaling that the answer is something more than zero. As Americans, we pride ourselves on the rule of law. And that means even the government has to follow procedures, even with dealing with non-citizens. And the story's not over. The legal fight will continue. The court will eventually decide what standards the president must follow in using the 1798 law. But in the meantime, the justices chose to err on the side of protecting individual rights, if only to make sure that when deportations do happen, they happen with at least a minimum level of due process observed. Thanks for watching. This was a quick dive into due process and deportations. A pretty heavy topic, but an important one. These issues make us reflect on what fairness under the Constitution really means. I hope it clears up some of the confusion many people have about what due process is in different legal situations. If you found the video informative, hit that like button and subscribe for more updates on big legal decisions. And let me know in the comments, do you think immigrants facing deportation should get protection similar to criminal defendants? Or are the current procedures enough? It's a tough debate at the core of who we are as a country. And join us next time as we dive into more constitutional controversies.